From the vibrant streets of Bulawayo to the corridors of one of the world's most renowned broadcasters, Narendra Morar's journey is one of resilience, intellect, and pioneering vision. Born in Bulawayo, southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, Narendra Morar experienced the realities of a segregated education system before leaving for the UK in 1974 to pursue higher studies. He earned a BA Honours in politics from Birmingham Polytechnic, setting the foundation for what would become an extraordinary career in media. By 1987, Narendra was headhunted by the BBC, choosing to forego a PhD on African Studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London to take on a new challenge in broadcasting. His rise was swift. By the mid-1990s, he was leading multicultural programming for BBC World. Over the years, he played a pivotal role in shaping international media narratives, from his early research with London Weekend Television to his tenure as series producer for Channel 4 and editor for BBC Asian. As BBC World's commissioning editor for India from 1998 to 2008, Narendra recognized the country's growing influence in global media, once stating, "After Europe, India is the biggest market for BBC World." A thought leader in digital television, he believed in its transformative power, saying in a 2004 interview, "Programming is an art, and one goes by intuition. 5 or 10 years is a long way off. The product cycles are much shorter, and success lies in keeping everything simple. To me, digital television holds the key to the future. In fact, in times to come, the television viewer may have many options." Now semi-retired near East Grinstead in southeast England, Narendra dedicates his time to charity work, researching the history of Asians in Zimbabwe and his passion for philately. In the heart of southern Rhodesia, forging a future as an Indian minority was a journey of resilience, determination, and survival.
In this section, we feature a 30-minute special interview with Narendra Morar from the United Kingdom. We will focus on his work on a publication, Colour, Class and Caste in Rhodesia. Our focus will be on the life of the Jivan family under southern Rhodesia as second-class subjects. So now let's join this ex-BBC expert on another area of expertise in the area of colour, class and caste in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, with focus on the Jivan family. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome to my virtual studio, Yogi Production House, with the author, writer and researcher for the publication Colour, Class and Caste, Rhodesia to Zimbabwe, My Family and Other Indians. Our guest today is none other than Narendra Morar, an old friend who used to be my senior all the years from primary to high school. Welcome, Narendra.
Thank you very much, Yogesh.
So let's go back to your grandfather's days. Your grandfather, Morar Jivan, was born in then Baroda, Gujarat state in 1894. He migrated to southern Rhodesia in 1907 at the very young age of 13. Narendra, tell us a little about his journey and how he settled down and how he developed the retail shoe trade.
Well, I think in order to understand my grandfather's journey, really, you need to put it in the context of the British Empire itself. And in order to understand that, you need to understand that his journey was part of a much greater journey of migration of Indian peoples throughout the globe. And this occurred as a result directly of the abolition of the slave trade in the 1830s by the British. When the slave trade itself was stopped, the capitalism required a new form of labor. And there was an interim form that was first of all established, which was, of course, indentured labor or contract labor. And contract labor was the sort of labor which was on short-term contracts, whereby people who entered into those contracts were, of course, losing their rights for those 3 years or 5-year contracts. And they came as laborers to work the sugarcane plantations in places like Mauritius, South Africa, and the Caribbean. And also to work on the railways in the construction of the railways in East Africa. In their wake, you also had what are called passenger Indians. And these are called passenger Indians because they paid their own passages. And of course, all the people that came to Rhodesia were primarily passenger Indians, like our parents, all the Gujaratis. And they came to service the needs primarily of the indentured laborers. So they are part of, if you like, almost a secondary migration to the indentured laborers. So in terms of my grandfather, he was following in the footsteps of other fellow Gujaratis as well. And in a way, if you look at it in terms of Southern Africa, many of the people who land up from India in Southern Rhodesia are, in fact, it's part of a deflected immigration from South Africa. Because already South Africa, as we know, had Indians from 1860 to work in the sugarcane plantations. But as discrimination and racism grew in South Africa against Indians, and they were trying to stop immigration of Indians into South Africa. So people were being deflected into the either Portuguese East Africa, which was, of course, Mozambique, or Rhodesia itself. And that's how you start getting Indians coming into Rhodesia, either through the south, from South Africa itself, or through the east via the port of Beira in Mozambique. And my grandfather, of course, lands in Beira. And from there, he, along with many other Indians, walked and worked along the line of rail all the way to Umtali. From there, he went on to work for a while in what was the town of Selukwe, which was a mining town. And of course, there was opportunities there because as a mining town grew, there was opportunities to work. My father was a mochi, a cobbler. So therefore, he worked with leather. Therefore, there was opportunities to mend horse harnesses, mining equipment, and of course, shoes. And from there, eventually, he lands up in Bulawayo. And that's where he eventually settles permanently.
Tell us more about how the rest of the family came to Southern Rhodesia and how the family grew.
Okay. So again, this is quite a typical pattern that occurs, is that originally, of course, most of the immigrants that come to a place like Rhodesia from India are single men. And they come because they're trying to better their economic futures and to try and to look after their families back in India. So they come originally as single men. They then eventually go back when they have accumulated some capital to go and fetch their families. Sometimes they bring the younger boys who are capable of working over. So initially my father was brought over. And ultimately my grandmother was also brought over, and eventually my mother came over as well. So there's a pattern here, and this is a pattern that's quite commonly repeated amongst many Indian people. In terms of my own family, as I talk about in the paper that you referred to, he joined a partnership of cobblers, and they formed almost like a cooperative. It was a cooperative based completely on trust. There was no legal documentation at all. What they did was they got together and decided to pool all their resources together. And it was economies of scale, if you like. And through the economies of scale, they were able to actually expand and consolidate the business. It gave them several advantages. First of all, you had the economies of scale. Secondly, you had, if there were any young learners, they learned the trade while working with their elders. They could learn the craft from them. Thirdly, quite often, of course, at least one of them would want to go back to India to visit the family, bring back their wives or kids or whatever. So it meant that the business could continue without it having to stop, and so on. So this enabled the company to thrive. And this company was called Dulla Brahma Company, DRC for short. And this thrived for many years and enabled quite a few of the mochis in Bulawayo to establish themselves.
Narendra, let's look at what were some of the major hardships during those days for early settlers, like your grandfather.
Right.
Trading licenses, laws, and treatment in the status of second-class settlers.
Right. So of course, Indians coming onto the scene in Rhodesia. Let's not forget, Rhodesia was invaded through the pioneer column by Cecil Rhodes' pioneer column. And this was seen initially as a white man's country, or was always seen as a white man's country. And it was premised on one fundamental issue, that it was going to be a second Rand, a second El Dorado. The idea was that they were going to find lots of minerals and especially gold, just like they had found on the Witwatersrand in South Africa. And they didn't want anybody else, any other alien creatures like Indians coming in to compete against the white settlers. That was the first fundamental premise that you have to understand. Then when it was discovered after 10, 20 years that actually Rhodesia was not the second Rand, of course, the white settlers were then very keen to stop Indians from competing in all the other areas of economic activity, such as commerce, agriculture, mining, any of those areas where they themselves wanted to now compete. They were going to stop Asians from competing in any way possible. And so they start introducing legislation, both in terms of immigration and in terms of commerce. So let's just take a look at a couple of things. They start initially by introducing anti-immigration legislation, which is modeled on South Africa. So more often than not, you'll find that time and time again, whatever happens in South Africa, a few years later in terms of legislation, happens in Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia. They simply copy and paste very similar laws. So when the South Africans in Natal, for example, start agitating against having too many Indians in Natal, and they talk about Natal being overrun by aliens and so on, meaning Indians, they introduce legislation to stop Indians coming in anymore. So this very similar thing start happening in the early years of settlement in Rhodesia as well. And they try and stop Indians from coming. Of course, there's one problem, because the imperial authorities, i.e. the British government, is bound by its own promises of equality of all British subjects. So they have to maintain a form. They can't have overtly racist legislation. So as long as the legislation is not racist in words, then it's okay. If it's racist in effect, they don't mind. But as long as it's not in words. So you can't say non-Indians are not allowed, but you can say people who can't speak English are not allowed, and so on. So this is how they maintain, they introduce and consolidate discriminatory legislation within the country.
In your research, you talk about legislation, and you have given us quite a lot of background. Tell us more about 1895, the Chamber of Commerce regulations against Asian traders.
Yes, well, again, this is, as I hinted earlier, there were three particular lobbies over time that really agitate against the Indian presence or Asian presence in what is Zimbabwe today. One of the key ones early on is what they call the white commercial vested interests. So white traders and white shopkeepers were very, very scared of competition from Indians because they knew that Indians could undercut them. They knew that Indians were more competitive, and they didn't like this, because they were scared of going out of business. So the only way they could compete against Indians was by having laws that would discriminate against Indians and make Indians less competitive. So you do that by either stopping the issuing of licenses or making it very difficult for them to obtain licenses. So, for example, if you look at the rural areas or mining areas, they simply wouldn't issue licenses to Indians at all in order to stop Indians from competing. Or where they were allowed to have licenses legally under the law. For example, in urban areas, they actually attacked Indian enterprises, like in Umtali, the very, very famous case of Bimji R. Naik. When he was granted legally a license, the settlers literally invaded his shop and demanded that he take all his goods and his stuff and go back to Mozambique and just leave. And of course, the administrator had to declare that this was illegal, and he was allowed to actually stay. Then Bimji R. Naik, to his credit, stood up to the settlers and fought a very great battle on behalf of the Indians to be allowed to keep his license and this set a precedent for other Indians to be allowed to have licenses in the urban areas at least.
Also, I noticed that in 1903, there was an immigration residence audience on
Ordinance,
Indian
yes.
settlers. What was that about?
Well, again, it was part of the same thing. It was to restrict the number of Indians coming in. It was in order to try and discourage. It was essentially sending it was again trying to discourage as much as possible Indians from coming into the country or settling in the country. And you do that by various different strategies. For example, a language test. So why, you say, for example, that you can only come in if you can speak a European language. But of course, most of our Indian people at that point could only speak Indian language, and they were perfectly literate in Indian languages, but that wouldn't count. Yet European artisans, for example, skilled European workers who couldn't read or write in a European language would still be allowed. So there was overt and covert discrimination going on.
1908, there was some impact on Asian traders not able to get licensing in the central business district. And you wrote a little about your grandfather's problems on this issue.
Yeah, well, again, the same thing. 1908 is when they keep trying to stop people from trading, and it wasn't just in terms of businesses. It was also in terms of you see, what happens is, because, as I mentioned earlier, when the white settlers realized that there isn't this great second El Dorado, this great second Rand with massive gold reserves and so on. So they suddenly realized that actually we're going to have to start either farming or enter into commerce or something else, as opposed to making a quick buck in finding a gold mine. That they're going to have to start competing in other areas of economic activity. Suddenly they find there's possible that there's Indians there that are already doing these work, and they have to somehow get rid of that competition or suppress that competition. And that's what all these pieces of legislation are always about, ultimately. The ideological, if you like, the ideological face is a racist rhetoric. But the underlying reality is about economic competition, because that's what they're scared of.
Yeah,
and that's always the case.
Yeah, tell us a little about the cobblers during the time of your grandfather's time, and also how the caste factor played in.
Right. Okay. So if you think about it, in East Africa as an example, where you had a very large Indian or Asian community, so you could have very large organizations based on caste or religious sect and so on. And it was very easy to have separate facilities for everything, schools, madrasas, you name it, everything was, you could, and Ismailis were a classic case of this in Kenya, for example. In Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia as it was then, this was less so. However, despite that, the one or two of the castes, especially the so-called lower caste, like the Mochis, did have, from very early on, established their own caste associations. And primarily, these were what they would describe as self-help organizations. They were designed primarily to raise funds to help especially poorer members of their own caste, and also to raise funds for education. Because one of the key things was about self-improvement. And that was one of the key aspects of these caste associations, always, was self-improvement. And the key to seeing of self-improvement was education. And too many of them couldn't afford education. So having these little caste associations where people subscribed and gave a bit of money helped educate some of the sons and daughters, especially the sons, early on.
Let's go back to 1935. Your grandfather started his own business with your father.
Correct.
Road Street, Bulawayo, which we all know.
Yes.
And it was called Mr. Jivan and Sons.
Jivan and Son, yes.
This is a property which also was part of the business district.
Yes. Okay. So as I said earlier, wherever possible, the whites tried to circumscribe economic activity by Asians. And they did this primarily in commercial areas through the covenants and deeds by stopping people selling their business, their titles, land titles to non-whites. However, in the early days, some of those titles had been sold, so they couldn't be the covenants couldn't be enforced against Asians. And there were certain areas in Bulawayo, for example, the areas of Lobengula Street and going all the way from First Avenue all the way up to the 13th Avenue and towards the power station. And then there was this area between First Avenue and the City Hall, where Queen's Park, in other words, and City Hall, which was a kind of a closed-off section of the city, which was less desirable precisely because it was closed off, which was available. And people, the whites didn't object too much of having some Asians. And because the Asian peasants was there from very, very early on, it was difficult to move them out, which is why my parents and various other people had both domestic and commercial premises there. Hasselmans, their residence was there as well, next door in 57. I think they were number 57 or 59, next door. That's where they lived.
In your booklet, you also focus in on the settlers. Like all Asians, my grandfather was subject to discriminatory policies of the Southern Rhodesian government. Explain your story as well the story about the Liquor Licensing Act, which
Yes.
affected your grandfather in 1950.
Right. So, well, I used just two examples. One of them was the Liquor Licensing Act, and the other one is about the Firearms Act. And both these acts were introduced basically to stop both Asians and blacks from access, or rather controlling access to both these items by Asians and blacks. And the reason being that the white settlers were still worried after the 1896, 1897 risings, that a collusion between the Asians and the blacks together would result in the overthrow of the white settler state. And therefore, any Asian who wanted to have hard liquor would have to get a certificate from the colonial secretary himself. And I still possess the actual certificate that my grandfather obtained. Similarly, if you wanted a gun, which very few Asians were ever granted, you had to again get permission. Whereas for whites, it was no problem at all. And they never needed a liquor license. They were just allowed to have licenses. So it shows the discriminatory nature of the state.
Tell me, Narendra, you mentioned now we're crossing from your grandfather to your father, Lallu Morar, who, of course, we all knew very well, and your mother. You mentioned a lot about segregation and how it also affected your family, more so your father. So tell us a little bit about that. And also let's go back to your early childhood, primary and high school.
Okay, so I think the way to tell the story really is the term I like to use is life chances. From the day you're born till the day you die, there are certain things that happen. And it's a good way of asking, so if I was born a different color, or if I was born in a different circumstances, how would that have been different? Or how would it have been better or worse? So if you're an Indian child or an Asian child born in Rhodesia in the 40s, the 50s, or whatever, so first of all, you'd be born, either there'd be no hospital at all, as in the case of my father or indeed my grandfather. So you'd probably be born at home. The whites would, of course, have had hospitals. If you were an Indian, you'd only be able to go to a particular school. In Bulawayo, that would have been McCurtain School. There were no other schools. And McCurtain School was a school for both Indians and so-called colored people. And it only went up to standard 4. Then, if you wanted to go further, you could not go further in Rhodesia at that point, which is what happened to my father. He wanted to study further. He was always a studious man. but he couldn't go further because there was no further schooling available within the country. So in the end, he lands up working with my grandfather in the shop as a cobbler. And I think he would have been a very good student, but that's the way it turned out. In my case, it was by the time, of course, I grew up, there was not only was there a new school that was created by the Indians after a lot of pressure, because the government initially did not want to create an Indian school. They absolutely were adamant that there wasn't enough demand, or it just wasn't justified. In the end, the Indians themselves created their own school and eventually got the government to then sponsor it, which became the Robert Treadgold School. And then after many years, in the 50s only, did we get the first ever secondary school, Founders High School, in the whole of the country. And again, that became a mixed Indian and colored secondary school. Whereas there were many secondary schools in Bulawayo, but they were all white, and we were not allowed to attend those, as you know. So there was always this discrimination. So this is what I mean by life chances, that if you were white, you had choices all along. But if you were not white, your choices were extremely limited. Or only if you had money could you go to India or somewhere else to go and study.
Let's go back and zero in at your high school days.
Right.
Would you recollect some stories where you were conscious or you actually faced discrimination yourself?
Oh, yes, easily. I mean, to take one or two examples. One was, I still remember vividly when, and this was, I think, either very late 60s or very early 70s, where we were banned then from going to play sport at any white school. And the excuse was that they didn't have toilet facilities for us. Yet they could come and white pupils could come and play sport at our school. So this was a bizarre instance. Or the second one, the cadets, the Army cadets, of which I was a member in the lower sixth form, I think it was. And we had World War II single bolt action rifles. And they were taken as soon as the war started getting hot, 1971-ish. All our guns were taken away. I don't think the same thing happened in any of the white schools.
Let me go back to the CBD, Commercial Business District area of Bulawayo.
Sure.
So it was in 1970 that, if I'm correct, your family finally got a license in a very prime CBD area.
Correct.
That's when your father started Jivan Shoes. Tell us a little about that.
Well, yes. I mean, there were two. I mean, it was by then. It was possible to get in areas like that. It was possible to get a license in some of the premises. It depended. See, some landowners by then were willing to rent out premises, and they tended to be the more what you would call with the small L liberal whites, and they tended to be more generally Jewish. So the property that my parents rented was, of course, owned by the Laskers, and the Laskers were the owners of one of the biggest clothing firms in the country, Archer Clothing, and they're the ones who rented the property to my dad, which became Jivan Shoes. So there were a few landowners who were willing to do that, but there were few. Well, the same didn't apply though for residential properties. There was an almost total ban for all the white suburbs like Kumalo and so on. You would not be able to buy a property in those areas. It was almost impossible.
Yeah, in 1980, April, Zimbabwe finally got its independence.
Yes.
You in UK, I was in India at that time because I only arrived 1980 in May. How do you reflect on that day when Zimbabwe got independence and the Indian population, the black population, the colored population, now they were full citizens of a country?
Okay. Well, first of all, I was actually in Kenya. I was not in England. I'd been in Kenya for that, and I was there for a
Oh,
whole
yeah,
year.
for your PhD research.
I was researching. Yeah, exactly. It was total jubilation. I mean, it was. Don't forget, people like myself had been monitoring the situation for some years very closely, so we knew what was going on, and uh, uh, and I for one, and my colleagues close to me, we all knew we knew that Mugabe was going to win. It was never a question of whether he was going to win. It was just by what margin. No, that's where the question always was. So that wasn't the issue. On the day of independence, everybody was just happy. I mean, there was no other way of putting it. It was just fine. And for me, it was a big thing because it was the first time I would be able to go home after 6 years. I had not been home since the day I left in 1974, and I had not seen my family for 6 years. So for me, it was a big deal. And I went home in June. I managed to go home in June of that year. So it was a big deal. And of course, it was a really, really important day. But equally, myself and my colleagues were not naive to believe that somehow this was going to solve everything. And it was all going to be hunky-dory afterwards, and it was going to be paradise regained. Because you just had to look at the the shenanigans that had gone on, not just uh, between the parties, i.e. ZANU-PF and ZAPU and so on, but also within the parties as well.
We are in the process from going back from high school days. You never returned to Zimbabwe. I never returned. You are staying in UK. I'm in Canada. And a lot of our colleagues are all over the world, New Zealand, Australia, all over. What would you like to say about that situation?
Well, I mean, I went back several times to Zimbabwe, and I did look at the situation there, uh, and and I found it sad because I think the problem was this, that you had a party that came to power, ZANU-PF, which had a particular view of society that it had to be a one-party state, and that only a one particular view should predominate. Whether it's a view of history, whether it's a view of the current situation or the view of the future. And it's something that, having worked in television, as you know, for all these years, is not one I can subscribe to easily, where I've always believed in the multiplicity of views, even if you don't agree with it. And a liberal democracy is always about having contested views and challenging and debating those views openly and honestly. And if you have a society where you can't do that, it's difficult.
Okay, let's conclude by looking at the Jivan family again. I told you earlier I didn't want to really ask you this question. So if you're not comfortable, you don't have to answer it.
Sure.
Where are some of the members of the Jivan family, the original Jivan family from Bulawayo?
Right. So my brother, my one brother and sister are in South Africa.
Yeah, that's
Another,
Yeshua.
sorry,
Yeah,
Yash
Yeshua.
and Ranjana.
Yeah,
And my eldest sister, Hasu, is
yeah.
in England, lives quite near to me. In fact,
Right,
yeah, I had lunch with her today, just before
right,
your interview with you.
right.
And those are the closest family. And then, of course, other family members we have, part of the extended family are here in England. Others are in United States. And then I've got other extended family in Leicester, in Oldham, and so on, which are from my mother's side as well. So there's a pretty good geographic spread
Right.
around the world.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Narendra, for this wonderful interview and insight. And as I say, I have definitely complimented and highly regarded your work in this effort. It's so nice reading all the information you gathered, and it was tough work, hard work. So congratulations on that.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you to say that. Thank you very much. I
Uh,
just hope I hope it inspires other Zimbabwean
yeah.
Asians or Indians to
Oh,
actually contribute to tell their stories, because I think it's about telling stories and
yeah.
and also memorializing our parents and grandparents who had it tough. I mean, we've had it easy compared to what they went through. And I wish more of our people would come forth and preserve and archive online pictures, documents, whatever, so that it's preserved for future generations, so people can understand what they went through and what a sacrifice they made for us, so we can have a good life today.
Yeah.
And I think that for me is one of the motivating factors of having done this, and to tell people this is what our parents did for us.